What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be doing a complete hero guide for the big bad of Star Wars Emperor Palpatine. In these hero guides, we're going to be covering everything that could possibly need covering, from base stats, ability stats, the best star cards for Galactic Assault and Supremacy, as well as some of the best maps to choose them on, some general tips for those game modes, the best star cards for heroes vs villains and hero showdown, which enemy characters you need to look out for, and then lastly covering some general tips for the hero game modes as well. So as you can see, this guide is going to be breaking down every single aspect of the hero. If you're new around here and you end up enjoying the video, then be sure to subscribe to the channel for more Battlefront 2 content, and be sure to hit that notification bell as well so that you are notified each time I upload more videos like this going forward. But anyway, with that out of the way, let's get stuck right into it. So getting into Palpatine's base stats, and he does definitely have some of the more unique stats in the game, seeing as he is essentially the only non-droid hero that doesn't use a lightsaber or a blaster. Starting off with his base HP, he has 700, which is obviously above average for most blaster users, which is what most people in the community would probably class him as, or at least a non-saber user anyway. And as for how much health he can regenerate at once, he can regen up to 250 HP, which is on par with most saber heroes in the game. So honestly, his health stats are pretty awesome considering he's not a saber user, equaling the likes of Maul across those stats. In terms of his damage, he deals 60 damage per second with his one-handed attack and 110 damage per second with his two-handed attack, which if you didn't know that was a thing, now you do, because I get a heap of comments from people only just finding out that he has both options. So if you only just realized you can do twice as much damage, then don't worry, you're definitely not alone. In terms of the stamina for those lightning attacks, if you use the one-handed attack, it will last for 10 seconds, totaling 600 damage dealt before running out of stamina. Or if you use the two-handed attack, it will last for only 6.5 seconds. However, that still totals 715 damage before running out of stamina. So there's essentially no reason to use the one-handed attack at any given time. Now moving on to his abilities, and he does have some useful abilities. I wouldn't say any of them are really top tier, but they do all have their moments, and they can definitely be useful if you can learn when and where to use them. His left ability is called Chain Lightning, and this one causes Palpatine to send out a single burst of lightning towards his enemy. It deals 120 damage per use, which is not quite enough for a one-hit kill, but it can be a great finisher. And the other awesome part about this ability is that it can actually bounce to multiple enemies, so if you hit one and then there are say 3 enemies close to that enemy, it can actually end up hitting all 4 of them. It has a 15-second cooldown, which is definitely pretty good considering how useful the ability can be. Moving on, we have his middle ability, which is called Dark Aura, and this one causes Palpatine to charge the air around him with force energy. It deals 135 damage over a span of 8 seconds, so just under 17 damage per second, and it also slows enemies who are within the area of effect, causing them to become sitting ducks. It does, however, have a 25-second cooldown, which is essentially one of the longest cooldowns in the game, so that is definitely a negative to the ability. Now, for his right ability, we have Electrocute, and this one just essentially stuns anyone that it hits. It deals no damage to those enemies, but it will stun them for about 1.5 seconds all up, giving you a slight advantage in that battle. And it has a 20-second cooldown, which definitely isn't the best, but it is probably more than fair just for balancing reasons. So that is it for all of his base stats and abilities, and now we're going to move on to some tips for Galactic Assault and Supremacy, starting off with his best star cards. Keep in mind these are just a matter of opinion. There aren't really any loadouts in the game that are objectively the best or anything like that, but these are just what I find to work best in these game modes. The first card I'd recommend is the Lightning Reach card, and this one just increases the range on his lightning attack by up to 30%. Now, his only real weakness against troopers is his range, honestly, and so increasing that range is an absolute no-brainer. The second card I'd recommend is the Surge of Lightning card, and this one allows Chain Lightning to bounce to more targets. This card is really good for increasing those big multi-kills, and if you can fire off a Chain Lightning into a hallway of enemies who might be slightly injured already, you can easily rack up some huge multi-kills. The third card that I'd recommend is the Show No Mercy card, and this one makes it so that for every extra target that you hit with Chain Lightning, it will actually reduce the cooldown by 1/4 of a second to a maximum of 5 seconds. So you can wipe 5 seconds off the cooldown, and that is definitely a very useful card for obvious reasons. Now, moving on to the best maps to choose him on in Galactic Assault, the 3 maps that I personally think he's the best on are Hoth, the Death Star, and Naboo. All of these maps have great close quarters areas, and this is obviously where Palpatine is the strongest. The first phase of Hoth is obviously pretty open, but once you do get inside, it is absolutely the perfect situation for Palpatine, and same goes for the other maps as well. Now, moving on to some general tips for Galactic Assault and Supremacy, and Palpatine is definitely a very unique character like I mentioned earlier. He's almost a mix of a saber user and a blaster user in that you do have a little bit of extra range than a saber user, but you do also need to get up close and personal to do your best work, and so he can be a little bit tricky to get the hang of. The main tip that I have for Palpatine is just to make the most of his jump, and be sure to use it while you're attacking, as that gives you the best bang for your buck in terms of dealing damage while taking the least amount of damage damage yourself. Jumping high like Palpatine while attacking is something that none of the blaster heroes can do other than I guess Boba, but that's probably the main aspect of his playstyle, so that is slightly different. But yeah, no other ranged heroes can move like a saber user while attacking in a way that's more like a blaster hero, so that is something you definitely want to exploit as much as possible. I personally play with a scuff, so it's probably a bit easier for me, but you can still jump and aim on the way down while strafing and making yourself a harder target for the enemies to hit, so just make sure to practice that and get the hang of it. If you watch all of the better Palpatine players out there, none of them really attack while they're on the ground, rather they'll be jumping around like a kangaroo on crack and being a real pest for the enemy team to deal with. Now, one other thing that I thought was worth mentioning was that it is actually best to use Chain Lightning as a finisher rather than the initial attack. I see a lot of people using Chain Lightning first, then trying to finish off enemies with his regular attack afterwards, and don't get me wrong, it is still a decent way to play him and it's hardly a bad combination, but the best way to do it is actually just to damage the enemy first and then use the Chain Lightning as a finisher. The reason for that is that when you do use Chain Lightning, it has about a half second to a second delay before you can use any other attack, so if you use it first, you're kind of just sitting there waiting for your regular lightning to start working, and that can actually leave you pretty vulnerable. On the other hand though, if you damage the enemy troopers just slightly and then use Chain Lightning to finish them, it's essentially instant, and not only will you get the kills faster more often than not, but you'll also be safe during that quick delay since you've taken out the enemy, and so it essentially kills quicker and causes you to be safer at the same time. Like I said, it's hardly a necessity to do it this way, and it does obviously just depend on the situation of course, but that is something that I do try and do whenever possible, as it generally does work out better that way. To summarize, Palpatine is best played when you're constantly moving around and using his force jump while also attacking at the same time, as it makes you harder to hit for the enemies while not really taking any time off your own time to kill. And then as for Chain Lightning, try and use it as a finisher whenever possible rather than the opening attack. So moving on now to the hero vs villain game modes, and he is actually a really good hero in these modes so long as you do play him right. You kind of have to be a bit of a pest in all honesty, but he can be really good if you can manage to do that. Starting off with his star cards, and the first card that I recommend is the Lightning Reach card that I mentioned earlier for exactly the same reasons as Galactic Assault and Supremacy. The second card I'd recommend is the Rule of 2 card, and this one makes it so that enemies who are stunned by his Electrocute ability will actually take 30% more damage from his two-handed lightning. This one is definitely very niche and very situational, but I find that anytime I'm bothering to use Electrocute, it's in those dire situations where I really need to use it rather than just using it all the time, and in those dire situations a quick increase of 50 or 60 extra damage can make the difference in those really tight battles. The third card I'd recommend is the In Full Control card, and this one makes it so that lightning attacks drain less stamina. I find this one to be really useful against saber heroes because your lightning attacks actually drain their stamina really quickly, and having a little bit of extra stamina yourself generally means that you can actually deal a decent amount of damage once their stamina is drained, so for me this one is a must have. Now as for heroes that you need to look out for, the three that I've put here are Luke, Han Solo and Finn. Luke is self-explanatory with his damage output, Han will absolutely melt you if you're not moving around enough, and Finn's Deadeye is absolutely unstoppable against Palpatine if you're not near any cover, so these three are all very deadly at the worst of times. Now finally moving on to just some regular tips for the hero game modes, and as I pretty much always say, his playstyle in these modes is pretty much identical to his playstyle in the other modes. Without sounding like a broken record, everything that I mentioned for the trooper modes is pretty much the exact same type of stuff that I'd mentioned in this section, such as staying on the move, combining your abilities at the right times, and playing that sort of like pest type role where you're just always annoying the enemy team and causing them to panic. Palpatine is amazing at draining the stamina of enemy saber heroes, and so even if you're not necessarily dealing much damage or getting a heap of kills, if you're constantly pressuring the enemy team by just attacking them even if they're blocking, then that's going to be huge for your team. And I'd argue that a good Palpatine player, even if they're barely getting any kills, can more often than not make it impossible for the enemy team to win, just purely because of his ability to constantly pressure the enemy team, drain their stamina and easily dodge their attacks. Palpatine has one of the best dodges in the game too, specifically when you're dodging forward. So if an enemy saber hero is attacking you at close range, it's always a good idea to try and dodge through them rather than to the side or backwards, because you'll gain the most ground from them, and with 2 quick forward dodges, your dodges will actually have time to recharge by the time that they get back within range. So if you play it properly, you can almost have unlimited dodges in a way. To summarize, you just always want to make sure you're on the move and always trying to put pressure on the enemy team by constantly attacking attacking and throwing ability after ability at them to keep them on the back foot. And then when it comes to dodging and avoiding saber heroes, be sure to dodge forward and through them rather than backwards or to the side. But that is going to do it for this one, guys. As always, a massive thank you to my channel members and my patrons for the continued support. If you guys are interested in supporting the channel as well, then be sure to check out the Patreon page that is linked down in the description. If you enjoyed the video, then be sure to leave a like down below to support the channel, and be sure to subscribe with those notifications on so you don't miss out on any more Star Wars Battlefront 2 content. Thank you all so much for watching. You guys have a great day, and I'll catch you all in the next one.
Crush them! Make them suffer!